Now, an incentive reward is something that indicates that you're getting closer to your goal, okay? Now, explored territory is basically full of indications that you're getting closer to your goal. That's why it's explored, right? Because you've already transformed it from something unknown and threatening into something that you can use to get to where you want to go. And the left hemisphere does that. So it looks to me like, well, it looks to me like those things all sort of fit together. So adaptation basically means, in its most optimal sense, adaptation means that you have transformed something you do not understand into something that you can not only predict, but can use. Because you just don't want to transform everything into something irrelevant, right? That would be useless. You want to transform things you don't understand into things that you can do something with that you want to do. So
every individual has a different balance through which they approach, like the balance between the left and right hemisphere, or the approach to the known and the unknown.
Well, there's some evidence for variation in temperament. You know, some people are more inhibited and some people are less inhibited. Now, the problem with that is that, I believe that. I mean, it does look like there's pretty solid evidence for these temperamental variations. So you might say that you have a lower threshold, for example, for experiencing anxiety in the presence of something unknown than the next person does, and that's constant across situations. The problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the fact that what's unexpected is always construed in relationship to a story. My guess is that if people looked into this, they'd find that inhibited people have different stories about the way the world is constructed, and part of their biological predisposition towards timidity manifests itself in the structure of the stories they tell themselves about the world. It makes sense, because if you're more frightened by people, the stories you tell about them are going to be twisted more towards the domain of threat.
So does that balance also vary situationally? Like you said, if someone is refusing to accept anomalous information that does have relevance for their story, and they're ignoring it until it gets to a certain point where they can, where it sort of forces their...
Yeah, I think the whole last half of the course is about that. It's like, because one of the things that you can do to yourself to make yourself more pathological is just not adapt to anomalous information, and that makes you functionally pathological, I think.
So would that actually make the right hemisphere less reactive, or would it make it?
It would make the
I mean, is it?
I don't know.
Is it a compensating function, or is it?
I think what happens under those circumstances is the right hemisphere starts to make a lot of noise. So your dreams start to. One of the students I had in a class, this class last year, has just written a paper for me on the potential function of dreams. He points out that in neural net modeling of pattern recognition, there's a phenomenon called catastrophic failure, where if you have a neural net and it's got a bird category and a fish category, and you throw in a penguin, well, what happens is that the bird category and the fish category collapse, and all you get is animal category. So there's kinds of anomalous information that will blow whole categorization systems. So what he posited was that there's one system that does categorization, and another that slowly feeds it anomalous information, so it doesn't collapse, so it has time to adjust its structure to the new anomalous information without blowing its whole categorization scheme. Now, you have to have a categorization scheme, because if you don't know how to act. And if it's really global, like if I tell you, you say, well, how do I write an essay? And I say, you act like a human being. So this information is so vague as to be completely useless for the task at hand. You want to categorize it, you want information that's of sufficiently high resolution so that it'll aid you in your task. If I blow all your categorization sets and you're just left with this really amorphous categorization, you don't know how to act. So you want to maintain your categories. What he suggested was that dreams slowly move anomalous information up into the categorization schemes. So, in terms of your question, well, if you constantly ignore anomalous information pouring in from the right hemisphere, basically what you've done is categorize more and more information into the category of things that are so terrible they can't be faced. And I think what you do under those circumstances is you activate a monster, so to speak, that lives in your right hemisphere. And it gets more and more and more powerful until one day, when, at a weak moment, say, it just swallows you whole. And that's when you fall catastrophically into depression or into terrible anxiety, or maybe even, depending on your physiological predisposition, into something resembling schizophrenia. So key, because all that information that you've encountered that's anomalous, it's categorized. You categorize it by avoiding it, and the category is so terrible, I can't face it.
So you think that if you integrate it, you don't end up with nightmares?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Although, if you haven't been integrating it and you start, the nightmares might increase in intensity. Yeah, because it's also the case that when you are dreaming, you know, your spinal cord, your reticular activating system in part, is activating the hippocampus and the amygdala. And that's the part of the brain that deals with anomalous information. It reverts to brainstem control. So it looks to me like this is a reasonable hypothesis. You have a system that deals with what you know and another one that deals with what you don't know. You need both. If you ignore one, well, there's a whole social psych literature that says if you ignore anomalous information, you're happier. You know, which is that's a really appalling literature because they don't take temporal duration into consideration. It's real good in the short term.
And what
It's
literature is
really,
it?
oh, there's a whole.
What kind of-
Enhancement bias?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The positive illusion literature is Taylor.
Taylor and
Taylor
Brock.
and-
Yeah. I mean, it's being trashed with empirical data showing that, yeah, in the short term it's a good solution, but in the long term, you know, you get hostile and anxious and depressed, and people don't like you very much, which is, you know, hardly all that surprising. But they actually wrote self-help books. You know that? Self-help books telling people that positive self-illusions were good for mental health. Man, despite like 5,000 years of philosophical evidence to the contrary.
With both of these hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, working at the same time when you come across experience, what would happen to a split brain patient? Has there been any?
Well, we do know, for example, that I don't know the literature on emotional responsivity of split brain patients, but I do know that if you sustain right frontal cortical damage, it makes you inappropriately non-depressed and anxious. And what happens under those circumstances is that you acquire functional psychopathy, which basically means that psychopath doesn't regulate his behavior as a consequence of information that indicates that his behavioral output is doing something that in the long run is a bad idea. Well, there's a famous paper by Eslinger and Damasio about a guy who, can't remember his initials. He had an IQ of 143, right frontal damage. No measurable decrements in IQ, so he's still, 143 is 3 standard deviations above the mean. We're talking a very bright person here. But he makes series of catastrophic decisions that are of the sort that you'd associate with stupid criminality. He gets divorced, he marries someone who's very bad for him, basically. Gets involved in a whole series of terrible business decisions, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're missing the information from your right frontal cortex, you're happy, no kidding. It's because you've knocked out the whole system that deals with all those things that make you unhappy. But you have to be unhappy to live properly when you encounter those things that don't go out according to plan. Because if you don't attend to those things that don't occur according to plan, then you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you keep your model of adaptation stable in the face of shifting environmental contingencies. And what that basically means is that over time, the thing that's you gets old and senile. And that's how it's represented in mythology, by the way. That's the image of the wasteland. So, you know, that's the land where all the trees have dried up and everything's old and nothing grows. And you can read that as the absence of the positive aspect of the Great Mother, which means that there's no beneficial novelty around, or you can read that as the tyranny of stupid ideology.